Tell me about Tears of Honor. Why did you write Tears of Honor, and describe the research underlying the book?
I was asked to give a speech about the Supreme Court of the United States. I decided to give a speech about the failures of the Supreme Court. Great decisions that they have written that have proven to be disastrous, or that in retrospect people realize that the decision was wrong, maybe legally, perhaps morally, and there are a number of those. Dred Scott, among others, on slavery, this type of thing. And those were decisions that were in which the Supreme Court, to a certain extent, was affected by public opinion, driven a little bit by public opinion, as opposed to pure legal analysis. One of those decisions is a case called Korematsu versus the United States. Korematsu is the predicate decision involving the detention of Japanese in World War II, Japanese Americans. And so one of the things that always fascinated me about that case, and I studied it in law school, all law students do, in constitutional law, is that the liberals wrote the decision that basically upheld detaining Japanese Americans, and the conservatives wrote the dissents saying that this was a violation of the American Constitution. And what I tend to find about cases like that is conservatives tend to go for a very literal reading of the Constitution and stay away from reacting to the circumstances much more than the people that are more liberal judges. I'm not saying it as a criticism, I'm just saying that that tends to be what happened. The decisions in the dissents fascinated me. Justices Jackson, Murphy, Rutledge wrote brilliant dissents, just brilliant dissents, and then we had the great liberals. Douglas and Black and Frankfurter on the other side, particularly William O. Douglas, always regarded as the great liberal, and here he was basically advocating doing something that was just, to me, totally contrary to the American Constitution. And so I got up and I spoke about that, and as I spoke about it, I researched it, and I became really interested in the background of the detentions. How did this happen? What the facts were, less than the legal principle of the facts. And the more I read about the facts, the more interested I became, the more I read about the facts. And then I started reading about the detention centers. I mean, some like, for example, Manzanar that many people have heard of, but there were a lot of detention centers. I started reading about people that some of whom I actually knew, who had been involved in it, that I never knew they were involved. And it surprised me. And then I read about how the decision was driven. I mean, why was it decided to detain the Japanese, and how hypocritical it was, how bigoted it was. What was clear to me was that it was largely driven by prejudice rather than a real concern, although there was some concern at that time because of a failure to understand Japanese culture. And then I began to wonder, why did people respond this way, so passively? Japanese Americans just locking up their houses and going off to detention centers. And I thought about how people would react to that now. And why would young men who were locked up in concentration camps, and that's what they were, I mean, they weren't brutal, but they were surrounded by fences and concertina wire and armed guards, and they had guard towers with machine guns, and you know, people were ripped out of their lives and lived in tar paper shacks. And why would a young man leave something like that and volunteer to go into the United States Army to defend the United States that was incarcerating his parents? Why would you do that? And the more I thought about it, the more I read about it, the more I decided there is a story here, but how do you tell this story? How do you tell it from the perspective of the people that were detained, moms and dads, the young men who fought? That's a different perspective. And the government. And why did the government do what it did? And was everybody the same? And did they all feel the same way? And as I researched it, there were tremendous American stories. Neighbors, even my wife's family. My wife is Armenian. Her family, helping out neighbors who were Japanese, and other people in the Central Valley, which is where I'm from, Central Valley of California, taking care of their neighbor's home, taking care of their neighbor's land, taking care of their neighbor's store. And when people came back, handing over all of the money that had been made, handing over the keys to the store, which had been maintained, cleaning up the house and making sure it was ready for their neighbors to come back, and nobody expecting anything. I thought that's a tremendous story about Americans. And, you know, so it wasn't what people think. Everybody wasn't angry, everybody didn't agree, but it was a different time, and people didn't go out and riot in the streets. They did what the government told them to do. And, you know, why did people just passively go to detention centers? And how did they live when they were in there? And what did they do? I mean, what did they do when somebody died and they were all incarcerated? What did they do when somebody had a baby? And then what did you do when you went off to war and you realized that the uniform that you wore, that you weren't respected because you were Japanese and you weren't white? Or did everybody in the government agree with this? And why did these people, very powerful people, were they really that cynical that they were willing to do this? Did they really think this was right? And so those are the questions I had. And as I researched it, I started to think, how would I tell this story? And I kept reading and reading and reading, and one day I decided, I'm going to tell this story. And I was actually sitting down in the San Francisco International Airport, delayed because of a plane, and I pulled out a yellow legal pad, and I started writing Tears of Honor. And the opening lines that I wrote in Tears of Honor, which in 2022 won the silver medal from the American Association of Independent Publishers as Historical Novel of the Year. I'm very proud of that. Those opening lines that I wrote on that yellow paper, those are still the opening lines in Tears of Honor. So as I wrote, I realized I needed to talk to people, and I began to talk to people, and it was fascinating to me, talking to people who had been through this. And then I met a man who I had never heard of before I started researching this, by the name of Young-Oh Kim, and he was a Korean. And because he was Asian, he was not allowed to be in other primarily Caucasian units, so he ended up being sent to the all-Japanese 100th, which came out of Hawaii, and the prejudice that he confronted from the Japanese because he was Korean. And, so Tears of Honor in large part is about prejudice and bigotry and how shallow and unjustified it is, and ignorant. And of course, as I read more about Young O Kim, I realized that this man was one of the greatest heroes in American history, and hardly anybody knew about him. So I decided I wanted to meet him, and I decided he would be the arcing character in the book because he was so illustrative of someone. He'd been through everything. And so I actually got to meet Young O Kim, and I was privileged that when he died, I was one of the few Caucasians that was actually invited to his funeral. And it was amazing to meet him. I mean, he is a great man and a real American hero, beyond anything that I think the average person would understand. And so, and I had to research what the government did. Spent a lot of time in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Los Angeles, Washington, New York, just reading and trying to make things as accurate as possible and talking to people who were there. And it was, I really did love writing that book. I mean, part of the problem with me writing that book was I couldn't stop. I mean, the actual manuscript was 1,000 pages long. And when the editor first looked at it, his comment was, "You aren't Norman Mailer, you can't write 1,000 pages. We have to cut this back." That book, I was so fascinated with that period of history, I'd probably still be writing about it. But I'll tell you one thing about it. Going into the National Archives and doing the research, it made me proud to be an American. It really did. I mean, to be an American citizen, to go into the repository for our most precious documents, and simply by virtue of the fact that I was an American, to be given access to it, was unbelievable to me. And, have original documents carted out, and here you go, take a look. It was just amazing to me. I mean, where else in the world could you do something like that? And to meet people that had accomplished things that were so heroic, you couldn't even conceive of somebody doing things like that were well documented. The biggest obstacle for me in writing that book was to try and do justice to the people who lived that period of time and did it. I'm very proud of that book.